Now our next speaker is the man who really came up with the idea for this conference, despite his protest to the contrary. Mark Tooley. He is the president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy. And it is the IRD that is a co-sponsor of this conference with Beeson Divinity School and the Institute of Anglican Studies at Beeson. So please welcome Mr. Mark Tooley. I forgot to say the title of his talk is White Churches and the American Covenant.
Thanks, Jerry. This conference is not my idea. I very emphatically recall sitting with Jerry 2 years ago at another conference, and he scratched out the concept of this conference on a piece of note paper. So hopefully while he's sitting here, he's scratching out the concept for the next conference that will be organized. Well, this event, in case you're not aware, is very countercultural. To speak of or to imply a national covenant with God, as Abraham Lincoln or as Martin Luther King assumed, is today very unfashionable in much of elite American Christianity, to the extent that it's almost probably unrecognizable to many in the church, except perhaps as a very gross caricature. For many Christian thought leaders today, the concept is automatically associated with idolatrous forms of civil religion, with religious right activism, with at least semi-reconstructionist or dominionist forms of ultra-Calvinism, with thoughtless folk religion, with hyper-nationalism, or blasphemous equation of America with Israel, or even the church as a specially chosen people. Some of this dismissive attitude comes from what might be called the left side of American Christianity, especially influenced by neo-Anabaptist thought originating with John Howard Yoder, popularized by Stanley Hauerwas, and expanded by Greg Boyd, Brian Zahnd, and many others today focus on critiquing what they call quote-unquote empire. For them to presume America has a relationship or covenant with God, is to subordinate the gospel and church to this empire. God may condemn Babylon, but he has no interest in redeeming Babylon. Nor should the church, these neo-Anabaptists largely insist. God relates only to universal humanity, with perhaps some special covenant with the most downtrodden. Others who dismiss the idea of national covenant would be within right-of-center Christianity. They are typically Reformed, but reject any hint of Reconstructionism and don't like civil religion. For many of them, covenant occurs only between God and his chosen Israel and or the church. Nations are certainly under divine sovereignty, but they are not central players in God's purposes. These Reformed thinkers stress ecclesiology, but not so much public theology. They are sometimes concerned about conservative evangelical calls to national piety that imply covenant between God and America, such as the National Day of Prayer. For many of them, the recurring theme of the 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14, is disturbing. Of course, all of you know the words, "If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will hear their land." These critics perceive that whatever the intent of organizers, participants are conflating Americans with, quote-unquote, my people. When myself describing the purpose of this conference to friends, often the semi-negative response has been, "Oh, you don't intend to compare America to Israel, do you?" Or, "Oh, you don't mean to echo white Christian nationalism, do you?" Some in their heads immediately seem to picture the fireworks-studded July 4th patriotic worship at Pastor Robert Jeffress's First Baptist Church in Dallas, which perhaps you have seen on YouTube. Today's political climate is not conducive to careful consideration of national covenant. For this reason, maybe explaining national covenant in a thoughtful and rigorous fashion is more important than ever. The social justice and societal racial reconciliation that critics of national covenant advocate are arguably unattainable without some vision or version of national covenant. Critics and skeptics of national covenant often don't fully appreciate the history of national covenant and the American project, or they are aware of only a negative caricature of it. Yes, the Puritan divines spoke of it, they admit, but their theocracy is not relevant for today. Yes, the founding fathers spoke of it, sometimes supported by clergy of their day, but the founders were, from the left's perspective, self-servingly sanctifying their racist patriarchal republic. Or from the conservative purist view, corrupting American religion with their deism and presumptuous identification with the ancient Hebrews. Yes, Lincoln relied on national covenant, critics admit, but he was a founding theologian of American civil religion, which perfectionists of the left and right reject as a dilution or usurpation of authentic Christianity. Critics or skeptics of national covenant typically seem less aware that Martin Luther King, with much of the civil rights movement, relied on it. But to the extent they realize it, they likely dismiss it as its usage as merely MLK and the civil rights movement deploying language and concepts that would be religiously and politically motivating to white Christians of that day. Some would say that MLK was relying on the rhetorical tools of Christendom, no longer effective or even relevant in an ostensibly post-Christian age. Even more remote to most critics or skeptics of national covenant would be its usage by the social gospel in much of liberal Protestant political advocacy in the last century. This recollection is made more difficult by today's liberal Protestant political activists denying or minimizing this genealogy. But the original social gospelers saw their exertions as getting America right with God and amplifying America's calling to be a light unto the nations. Even if the loftier version of national covenant was later obscured by the religious left of the late 20th century, it was still unconsciously operating from at least the vapors of the premise. Today, the religious and evangelical left firmly reject national covenant, but they still speak and act as though America were under divine judgment, even if they reject the possibility or even the desirability of national redemption. Today's more conservative skeptics of national covenant are maybe more consistent in their minimization of America and God's economy, but their own witness for social righteousness is shackled to the extent they cite only the utility of the church's witness as a model for God's perfect kingdom. Their laudable efforts at racial reconciliation typically focus exclusively on the church, not society outside the church. The church's witness is incomplete if it doesn't seek to reshape all society towards divine justice and love, which by necessity entails identifying providential purpose in politics besides just the church. There's another source of resistance in American Christianity towards national covenant. Covenant is associated most especially with Calvinism. Non-Calvinists are often suspicious of it, or at least not entirely at ease with it. Calvin, of course, constructed a systematic theocracy in Geneva. Knox sought the same in Scotland, as did the Puritans in New England. Lincoln was not theocratic, of course, but was deeply shaped by the Calvinism of his youth and by the Presbyterian clergy who preached to him during his later life. Yet non-Calvinist Christians, of course, by tradition, also believe nations, both biblical and post-biblical, are under divine judgment and mercy. In his sermon, National Sins and Miseries, John Wesley explicitly warned of divine wrath upon Britain and counseled how Britain might escape wrath by national repentance. Wesley did not construct a Calvinist-style systematic theocracy, of course, but he did operate within a national church and sought spiritually to renew it and society through the proliferation of local Methodist societies, fostering personal and social piety. This incremental path to societal godliness would bring the nation into a more correct relationship with God, even if Wesley and Methodists did not cite specifically national covenant. This Methodist notion of national relationship with God, less statutory than covenant, was influential in America throughout the 19th century. Lincoln's Presbyterian pastor during his presidency, Phineas Gurley, reinforced Lincoln's concept of national covenant. But the other side of this reinforcement was Lincoln's friend and political counselor, Methodist Bishop Matthew Simpson, who was far more politically outspoken than Gurley. While Calvinists may have offered the cerebral concept of national covenant to Lincoln and his times, the more heart-focused idea of national relationship with God came from the heart-warm Methodists like Bishop Simpson. They too saw America as a nation choosing to be righteous or reprobate. Simpson, like Lincoln, believed America's relationship with God required ending slavery. He also agreed that America was the almost chosen nation, maybe even more zealously than Lincoln did. He was more optimistic than Lincoln and most Orthodox Calvinists about America's ability to become righteous. Methodism stressed the possibility of perfection through sanctification in the individual believer. It was not a long stretch, then, to imagine that at least some form of at least approximate perfection could be achieved theoretically by whole societies through sufficient spiritual and moral exertion. Simpson's daughters bequeathed their inheritance to Methodism's Temperance Board, which itself gave America prohibition, the supreme project of making America righteous. Lincoln was himself abstinent, but his dark realism almost certainly would have disapproved utopian schemes like prohibition. Prohibition was a transition from 19th century Protestant revivalistic moralism into the social gospel of the 20th century. It was rooted in national covenant. It failed, but from it sprang countless liberal Protestant crusades to purify America through political action. Theological modernists no longer believed that a personal deity would directly vent his wrath on a sinful nation, but they did believe that injustice in America placed the nation at odds with providential history and other cosmic forces for justice. Martin Luther King, in his appropriation of national covenant, was an heir both to the social gospel and, of course, to the black church tradition, which had its own robust version of national covenant. Like Thomas Jefferson, whose words of human equality he quoted in his I Have a Dream speech, he was a theological modernist who didn't necessarily believe in Christian creed, but did believe in biblical justice and in providence. Certainly he would have agreed with Thomas Jefferson when contemplating the simmering injustice of slavery in 1781 in Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia. And very much Jefferson here does not sound like a deist when he warns of divine judgment. So I'm going to quote from it, and you'll recognize the words, but listen carefully for the words that echo the themes of national covenant. So Jefferson said, "And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are of the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his mercy cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation, is among possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural interference. The Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in such a contest." Maybe echoing Jefferson, a progenitor of liberal Protestantism, Martin Luther King was the last major liberal Protestant voice who confronted America's sins with the language of national covenant. The Vietnam War, reinforced by theological revolutions and the start of mainline Protestant implosion, helped ensure the demise of national covenant as an ecumenical national tool. Liberal Protestantism thereafter saw America deserving doom, but was unsure about the desirability of its redemption. National covenant was, by the late 1970s, fully ceded to the rising religious right, which saw America as certainly almost chosen, but also often wicked and in danger of divine wrath thanks to abortion, pornography, the end of organized school prayer, and emerging gay rights advocacy. The religious right, through promotions like the National Day of Prayer, frequently cited the promise of 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14, which I already quoted to you. If conservative evangelicals earnestly prayed this prayer, it was surmised God may have mercy on America, as he offered to spare Sodom and Gomorrah for only a few righteous found in those wicked cities. Language of national covenant has remained embedded in American civil religion, of course. Presidents and other politicians cite the happy side of it, God's blessing, while largely ignoring the uncomfortable side of divine judgment for national sin. This omission largely echoes evangelical churches, which, though theoretically orthodox, also prefer to avoid themes of divine judgment, whether for persons or for nations. As others have noted, secular America has unconsciously retained the guilt and judgment side of national covenant, or at least a parody of it, but there is no atonement since there's no personal deity, only impersonal forces of progressive history that judge and condemn but don't forgive. Any return to national covenant will require renewed appreciation by America's churches. Christians who still believe in the American project will have to rediscover the tradition, both in American and universal church history. This challenge is hard because contemporary, largely non-denominationally minded American Christians are not today rooted in church history. They will also need to rediscover a God who offers both judgment and mercy. For the nation, liberal Christians prefer only judgment, even as they prefer only mercy for individual persons. Conservative Christians will need to articulate divine judgment for America more comprehensively and not just rooted in culture war hot buttons, important though they are. You may recall after 9/11, the infamous interview between Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell, where they both chuckled and agreed that 9/11 had been precipitated by gays and feminists, among others. That did not go very well for them, you may recall. No less importantly, Christian elites, both liberal and conservative, will need to rediscover and embrace the nation as providential tool. This challenge will also be hard, but both conservative and liberal Christians claim to want versions of righteous societies where God's justice is sought. Such societies cannot be sought if the nation itself is not recognized, loved, served, prayed for, honored, and warned away from its follies with earnest tears. Christians cannot fully serve God and fully appreciate his sovereignty and sureness of his love, superintending all creation, unless they seek his purposes for the nation, which traditionally is described as a covenant. May this conference on racial reconciliation and national covenant re-inject into American Christian consciousness a renewed sense of America under God, through which justice, racial and otherwise, may be sought through divine grace. And thanks once again to Jerry McDermott for thinking up this conference.